think it says horses, wagons, chariots, and Indo-European. And I can't read what it says under that. All right. Of course, the connection of horses and chariots with Indo-European speakers has been a major aspect of studying Indo-European origins for more than 100 years. This is the direction that Dorcas Brown and I have initially chose as our entryway into Indo-European studies when we began to look at these problems a long time ago, 25 years ago. Unfortunately, usually when people talk about the role of horses and horseback riding in early Indo-European society, they don't think of these images up here. They tend to think of this image of horseback riding, quite dramatic image. And I want to put that aside for the moment and take it back to more ordinary, everyday uses. The impact of horseback riding on Indo-European societies, particularly if what we were talking about yesterday is true and the homeland was in the steppes, the impact of horseback riding on herding, just on herding economies, is important enough by itself, without thinking about warfare, to have revolutionary effects on the people who lived in the steppes, because herders who are herding on horseback are more than twice as efficient at herding than pedestrian herders. So a man riding on a horse with a good dog can control about 500 sheep at maximum. A man on foot with a good dog can control about 200 sheep. So there's more than twice as many sheep that one herder can control. Labor is a major limitation on herd sizes. For pastoralists, most pastoralists do not have large families, unlike farmers. And most of your labor force comes from your own family, unless you go out raiding and capture slaves and bring them back and blind them or make in some other way prevent them from running away. But then they're not very good at herding. So the limitation of labor on herding sizes is really quite severe in Eurasian steppe pastoralism. So increasing the efficiency of a single herder is quite an important thing. Horseback riding did that, and I think that was probably its initial effect on herding societies. And then I also want to talk about the vehicles, wheeled vehicles. And first we should establish some definitions. On the lower left is a wagon. A wagon has 4 wheels. Sitting or walking driver, it's built for heavy loads. It can be pulled by oxen or horses. The basic definition is that it has 4 wheels. A cart is the same kind of vehicle, built for heavy loads with a walking or a sitting driver, but it has 2 wheels. And then a chariot is a completely different kind of vehicle. I want to emphasize this because people use the word chariot for the wrong kind of vehicle all the time. Chariots were the first vehicles that were built specifically for speed and maneuverability. And although it looks like a fairly simple object, this chariot, which was from Tutankhamun's tomb, there were 6 chariots in Tutankhamun's tomb, is really a marvel. When we look at the wheels, for instance, those look like spokes. Spoked wheels are one of the defining innovations that made chariotry possible. It greatly lightened the weight of the wheel. Everything about a chariot is designed to lighten the weight of the vehicle for speed and maneuverability. Those particular spokes in Tutankhamun's chariot are not really what you would think of as spokes. In fact, they are a V-shaped, 6 V-shaped elements, which are made out of a single piece, which meets at the hub, which acts as a shock absorber. On the outside of the tire, there are multiple layers of wood, and on the outside of that, leather, which also act as shock absorbers. The way that the car body is attached to the axle, you can see that there's a D-shaped car floor here, and it's hung from the axle, so it's hanging in front of the axle. That means that the driver is suspended between this point on the axle and this point on the yoke. Is this working? Can you see? Is the cursor working? Okay. So the car is suspended between the axle and the yoke. When the driver is standing in the car, the driver is actually standing out over the air, not on top of the axle, and that acts as another shock absorber. The floor of the car is made out of leather, not wood, so that there's a bound leather floor with crisscross leather straps. That, again, acts as another shock absorber. The way that the yoke pole is attached back here to the axle is actually rather complicated when you get into it and you look at it very, very closely. And that also acts not only as a shock absorber, but as an anti-roll device. So that even if a horse was to stumble on one side, the whole chariot will not flip over. There's a stabilizer built into the way that the yoke pole is attached to the axle. It's really a lot of thought and design and innovation has gone into producing a chariot. A chariot is completely unlike a wagon or a cart. A tremendous technological innovation, and it took great carpentry skills to make chariots. And then, when you think that you have to ride in this vehicle, there's no seat belts. It's an open back. You're riding at high speed. It's designed to go at high speed. That's the whole purpose, is to go at high speed. Somebody who is driving a chariot would experience it more like skiing than like what we think of as riding in a vehicle. You have to have your knees bent the entire time, so you're absorbing the shocks as they come. You're driving over uneven ground, very high speed. You have to be looking ahead exactly like a skier going down a steep slope, going over moguls. But if you're practiced at doing this, you could do it exactly like a modern Olympic skier does, just looking nonchalant as you're going along at 60 miles an hour and going over bumps and absorbing them with your hips and your knees. That's exactly how a chariot driver had to drive. And if you saw a chariot driver coming at you very nonchalantly, absorbing all of these shocks and looking like it didn't cost anything at all, you're looking at somebody who's been practicing for years. It took a great deal of practice in order to do this. And then when you think about the fact that you're going to do this in battle, and you're going to be doing all of this while you're attacking somebody and somebody is shooting at you with arrows and spears, and you're shooting at them with arrows and spears, you have to have your hands free. If you're driving and fighting at the same time, it's quite a trick. One of the things that's shown on the ancient illustrations is that they would sometimes drive with the reins around their waist so that their hands are free to shoot. And you would lean back and pull on one side or lean back and pull on the other in order to direct the chariot team. Roman charioteers did this in chariot races in Rome with no hands. They didn't have weapons. They were just doing it with no hands just to make the crowd applaud. But it could be done, and it's shown in ancient illustrations. More normally in warfare, chariots were driven by two people, one person to drive and one person to operate the weaponry, so they would be shoulder by shoulder crowded into the same car with the warrior maneuvering around the driver. Sometimes the driver would actually be holding a shield so that he would be able to ward off any arrows that were coming in while the warrior was fighting. It's a very complicated machine to develop, and importantly, because it was so complicated to drive and it took so much practice to use one effectively, it required an aristocracy. You couldn't be an ordinary person and learn to drive a chariot effectively in battle. You had to practice and practice and practice and practice. And if you're doing that, you're not a farmer. So when somebody is coming at you in a chariot and they look like they're comfortable in it, and they're not having any problem, and they're brandishing weapons, you're looking at a trained killer coming at you, and there's a lot of noise involved. Chariot is intimidating. And just everything that goes behind it in the training for riding a chariot effectively is intimidating. And that was one of the great effects of chariotry. It was intimidated people who were on foot. Where did chariots come from? The standard interpretation has been that they developed in the Near East from Sumerian battle wagons, which are documented in the early dynastic period, as early as 2800 BC. These are called chariots in numerous books and catalogs. Four-wheeled vehicles with solid wheels called chariots. So we all know now that that's an idiotic thing to say. And it bothers me to no degree to see this done over and over again. There was just a big conference on chariots and chariotry in which some of the people who were at the conference were talking about these vehicles as chariots, and a specialized conference on chariotry. Those aren't chariots, that's a wagon. That's a battle wagon. And it's thought that perhaps the battle wagon in ancient Sumeria evolved, as you can see there in the upper right, into a two-wheeled battle cart, which is shown in some of these illustrations, and then that evolved over time into chariotry. Now, there's no question that these Mesopotamian vehicles were used in battle. You can see that they're portrayed with victims of battle there in Mesopotamian art. But the chariot appears in the Near East at the earliest. It appears in Greece by about 1650 BC, Shaftgrave 4 at Mycenae. It appears two-spoke wheels with a standing driver, with weapons, with animals clearly identified as horses that have reins in their mouths. At the earliest in Old Syrian seal impressions about 1800 BC in the Near East. So the earliest chariots in the Near East that show up in artwork are about 1800 BC. What happened between battle wagons and chariots, and were chariots invented in the ancient Near East? In order to answer that question, we have to step back from the ancient Near East and look at the history of wheeled vehicles overall. And first we have to talk about the invention of the wheel. Now, normally when we think about the invention of the wheel, the first image that probably comes up is the caveman with the wheel that's being carved out of stone. There are so many jokes about this that it's a cliche. But in fact, when we think of it as the invention of the wheel and axle, it becomes clear that it was much more complicated than that. Wheels and axles are really quite complicated, load-bearing, moving parts. It took a long time for them to be invented. The axle, if it has wheels spinning on the ends of a fixed axle, which is one of the earliest designs for wheeled vehicles, if you stop and think about it, the wheel has to fit perfectly on the ends of the axle. If there is a misfit there, the wheel is going to wobble and the vehicle is going to fall apart. So the carpentry involved in just making a perfectly shaped hole in the middle of the wheel and a perfectly circular axle, right there you have some carpentry challenges. But also, you want the axle to be thick if it's going to carry a lot of weight, right? So the thicker it is, the more weight it can carry. But the bigger in diameter the end of the axle is, the greater the drag is on the wheel as it revolves around. The thinner the diameter of the axle, the less drag there is on the wheel as it revolves around. So actually, if you want less drag, you want a thin axle. So you have to come up with a compromise between less drag and good weight bearing. And in order to get that, you have to shrink the width of the vehicle so that the axle is short. If you have a short axle, you can make it relatively thin at the ends, the axle arms, the part that passes through the middle of the wheel. You can make it relatively thin, and if it's short enough, it'll still carry a good load of weight. But that means that the bed of the wagon has to be relatively narrow, and in fact, that's what the earliest wagons look like. The wagon beds are only about a meter wide, and the length of the wagon bed is maybe 2 meters. And most of the earliest wagons. Doesn't seem like much, but it's still a revolutionary vehicle and could carry a lot of weight. When you think about it that way, that's why wheeled vehicles were invented so late. In fact, there's a lot of physics involved and a lot of carpentry, highly skilled carpentry involved in making the earliest wheeled vehicles. Now, the earliest wheeled vehicles, I showed this slide yesterday, show up between about 3500 and 3100 BC. All of the radiocarbon dates cluster in this period. There may have been wheeled vehicles earlier than 3500 BC, but we have no evidence for them. After 3500 BC, we have evidence in a variety of different media, written signs in Uruk, Mesopotamia, #1, three-dimensional models in Hungary, two-dimensional images in a variety of places in Poland and Germany, and then actual wagon burials, more than 200 wagon burials in graves in the steppes, which are indicated by the dashed line. So given that we have evidence coming from really 4 different kinds of voices of material evidence, that probably indicates when wheeled vehicles were invented. We don't know where. We can't say where wheeled vehicles were invented. A variety of different scholars have made different hypotheses, but really the truth is wheeled vehicles, once they were invented, spread so quickly from Flintbeck at the base of Jutland all the way to Mesopotamia, or from Mesopotamia all the way to Flintbeck, or from somewhere in the middle, both ways. They spread so fast that we can't tell where they originate. And this is really actually an interesting observation, because there's nothing else that appears across that entire area between 3500 and 3100 BC. In 3500 BC, Mesopotamia, southeastern Europe, and northern Europe were in completely different cultural worlds. There is no evidence for trade from Mesopotamia to Jutland. But this one technical innovation was so useful that it just went as soon as it was invented and crossed what looked archaeologically to be pretty well-established cultural borders. And it's interesting to speculate on exactly how that happened. Pretty clearly it wasn't the wagons themselves that were traveling, it was the idea of the technology and the carpentry tricks involved in making it, so that the earliest wheeled vehicles in these places actually looked fairly different from each other in small details. It wasn't a single wagon maker that was traveling from Mesopotamia to Jutland, but it was the idea of wagon making and the technological tricks that were involved. The earliest wagons in the steppes, where I would put the Indo-European homeland, appear with the Yamnaya culture and probably are responsible for the appearance of the Yamnaya culture. At the bottom here is a kurgan with me standing on the top of it for scale. Just above that is a kurgan, a different kurgan that has a wheeled vehicle burial in it at the site of Balki, one of the earliest dated wheeled vehicles in the steppes. Here is the central grave. There is grave 57, the central grave with an individual on the bottom and the remains of 2 wheels, perhaps a cart. Although it's possible that the other 2 wheels have disintegrated, the wheels are usually just partly preserved. And often the grave itself was a symbolic representation of the wagon, and the wheels are put at the corners of the grave, so the wagon itself is not put in the grave, just the wheels. And the grave itself represents the wagon. But in exceptional cases, as in North Caucasian steppes, in the Kuban Delta, we have situations like this one at Lebedi, I think, Stani Kurgan, where the wagon was put right on the ground surface at the edge of the grave and then was covered by the kurgan. And so the whole wagon is there underneath the kurgan. This is the same wagon. This is the upper part of it as it was excavated, and you can see pieces of a reed superstructure, like a covered wagon, a kind of stoga, that was excavated on the upper part, and this is the lower part of the wagon with the yoke still preserved. In these cases, we can look at the wagons themselves, and we have extraordinary evidence on the nature of the wagons. And again, these are pretty small wagons, a meter wide, maybe 2 meters long. But they had a revolutionary effect on steppe economies. The reason that they had a revolutionary effect on steppe economies, I can't really describe until we add another element to the picture, because the wagons didn't affect steppe economies by themselves. It was wagons in combination with domesticated horses. And so to put those 2 things together, first I have to go through the domestication of the horse. Horses and gazelles were the large wild mammals of the Eurasian steppes, and of course the Eurasian steppes pass all the way across the center of the Eurasian continent, from the Carpathians on the west to the borders of China. The eastern part of the Eurasian steppes, the part that's labeled Mongolia, is quite a bit higher in elevation than the western part. An average elevation of about 1,500 meters for Mongolia, and there are mountains in between. So the classic Eurasian steppe environment is really this part in Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. And that's where wild horses were really in very, very large numbers and were consumed, hunted, eaten by prehistoric humans. The horses look something like modern Przewalski horses. Przewalski horses are the last and only truly wild horses in the world. 13 of them were captured in the wild in Mongolia in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. They were transferred to Western zoos. They weren't genetically modern Przewalskis. Modern Przewalskis are modern horses. We're talking about ancient horses in the past. But they probably look like Przewalskis because something didn't come up. That's a little Mac problem. I did have an image there. The earliest image of a horse dated to about 3500 BC on a silver vase from the Maikop site in the North Caucasus, and believe me, it looked like a Przewalski. Here's an image of the Eurasian steppes. The forest zone is in green at the top. Light green is the steppe environment, and then yellow is a semi-desert. The earliest evidence that's widely accepted today for the domestication of the horse comes from the steppes of central Kazakhstan, the Batai site, Batai and Kozhai 1, so I'm going to go there first. It's important to, I should say this, it's important to realize that at the time of the Batai site, 3500 BC, domesticated cattle and sheep had already been accepted and were being herded in the western steppes at sites like Syozhye, Falinsk, and Derevka. But domesticated animals went only as far as the Ural Mountains. And east of the Urals, no cattle, no sheep. You have foragers living out there. The only domesticated animal they had was dogs. And they were hunting wild horses, but they were also hunting a variety of gazelles and wild aurochs and other animals. And then around 3500 BC, these foragers in central Kazakhstan acquired domesticated horses, and it revolutionized their foraging lifeway. The Batai site, I'm standing on the Batai site here and taking a picture out over the steppes around Batai. And behind me, the site originally would have looked like this, with numerous different house pits. There are more than 100 house pits at the Batai site. There are about 5 excavated sites of the Batai culture in central Kazakhstan. They all look like this. Very crowded sites with deep house pits. After a house pit was abandoned, it was used as a garbage dump, and each house pit therefore contains huge numbers of horse bones. These people had domesticated horses, and they were mainly, for their diet, eating domesticated horses and wild horses. They were using horses to hunt wild horses, which they had done before, but now they had a much better tool for hunting wild horses, which is riding on domesticated horses. And their economy switched from a mixed hunting economy to an economy that 99.9% of the animal bones at Batai are horse bones. It's like the American Indians and buffalo. They entirely depended on horses. And when you look at the horse bones at Batai, there's over 300,000 horse bones at Batai, huge sample. There are mares with gestating fetuses. You don't kill mares with gestating fetuses if they're domesticated. But if they're wild, and you're rounding up large herds of wild horses and killing them all at once, in like the Box Canyon or something like that, then you kill them all. And that seems to be what they were doing. They were using horses to hunt large herds of wild horses, and the gestating fetuses are part of the wild herd that they were killing. These house pits can also contain, when you look at micromorphology of the soils, and Charlie French at Cambridge did this for Sandra Olson, who conducted the major excavation that discovered this, you find horse dung. Layers of horse dung in these house pits. Right there, that suggests domestication. Because you don't manipulate the dung of animals that are wild. There's no reason to. But if you're keeping domesticated animals near your living site, then you have to manipulate their dung all the time. And there are layers of horse dung in these houses right there that suggests domestication. This is just a shot of, Dory and I organized a conference at Bataille in 1995. This is a photograph from that, and they opened the excavation. This is the remains of one of these house pits that's just absolutely full of horse bones. There's a bunch of archaeozoologists at this conference who specialized in horses, and they were just ecstatic. The evidence for, and I can't read this here, the evidence for horse domestication at Bataille consists of horse dung being picked up and manipulated, microscopic identification of that. Horse milk, this is Richard Evershed and his students, really nice piece of detective work identifying not just milk products, but horse milk as a residue inside the pots, indicating that these people were drinking horse milk, which means that they were milking mares. You don't try to milk a wild mare. And so that definitely indicates that they had domesticated horses right there. The combination of the dung and the horse milk, they've got domesticated horses. But also, horses were butchered in the settlement. Very large chunks of these horses were thrown away. They weren't being really effective or functional in the way that they used horses. They had so many horses available to them that large chunks of these horses are thrown away in these trash pits. Usually if you're hunting wild animals, you dress them, you butcher them out in the field where you kill them, rather than bringing large chunks of bodies back to the settlement. Corral features were identified by concentrations of phosphates. Phosphates indicate a lot of dung. There's also high ammonia in these soils, indicating urine. Horse leg bones, the measurement of leg bones had changed their morphology in the direction of modern horses, which are somewhat less robust than wild horses. And then finally, Dory's and my research indicated that the horses at Bataille were bitted from the wear of bits on the horse teeth. This is a direction that we had chosen to study because it's actually difficult to prove that horses were domesticated. You have to use all of these techniques, which are not always available if you don't have Richard Evershed at your beck and call. And so using just the bones, it's been difficult to identify domesticated horses. Bitting is also important because it indicates it's direct proof that horses were ridden. If you have the wear of bits on horse teeth, then that indicates control from the back. Bits are only used to control a horse from behind. You would not use a bit to lead a horse because you just pull the bit out of the horse's mouth. A bit sits inside the horse's mouth, and it definitely indicates that the horse was used either for riding or for driving. Teeth preserve well, unlike most of the other bones, what we were just hearing. So if there's evidence of bitting left on the teeth, it should survive in a great many archaeological sites. Dory and I have looked at a lot of wild horse teeth, and we've compared feral horses and wild horses to bitted horses. For horses that have never been bitted, there's a 90-degree angle right there at the front. This is the front of the tooth. Horses have a molar row, and then there's a diastema here with no teeth where the bit ordinarily sits, and then they have their incisors up front. So the bit in a horse's mouth is normally sitting on soft tissue, which means that when you pull on the reins, you're pulling the bit into the horse's tongue and gums, and that's why a creature as puny as a human being can make a horse with a neck muscle this big around turn his head just by going like that. You're pulling the bit into the horse's tongue and gums, and the horse will turn its head to avoid the pain. And if you pull both reins, then the horse will duck its chin in to avoid the pain, and that makes the horse stop. So horses often will manipulate the bit with their tongue. They will elevate the bit with their tongue and then push it back into their teeth. But in order to do that, the soft corners of the cheeks are actually in front of the molar row. The soft corners of the cheeks are up here. So to get the bit back into the teeth and get it between the first premolars, the horse has to push the bit back into its cheek. So the bit is actually spring-loaded. It's on a spring. And if the horse lets go at all with the front teeth, the bit will slip right back down onto soft tissue. So in order to keep the bit in its teeth, we've all heard this expression, a horse taking the bit in its teeth. That's the horse taking charge of the situation because you can't hurt it anymore. When the horse takes the bit in its teeth, it has to hold down very, very firmly indeed in order to keep the bit there. And that's what creates the wear on the very tips of the premolars. You can see in the bottom photo a horse that has extensive wear on the lower premolar here. Now remember, an ordinary unbitted tooth has a 90-degree angle there and is in perfect occlusion with the tooth above. At Bataille, we found quite a few teeth. We found 5 teeth from at least 3 individuals that had bevels that were more than what we had established as a minimum threshold for defining bit wear. So according to our evidence, horses, at least some of the horses at Bataille, were bitted continuously over long periods of time. It takes a long time to wear down that animal, and that indicates that they were ridden. There has been a criticism of our research, as there always is. One of the critiques has been that this kind of wear maybe occurs naturally as a natural pathology in wild horses, and how can you tell the difference? So we looked at a large number of feral Mustangs at the bottom, 31 teeth, and then when there's a lysis site, it's a Pleistocene site with dead horses in it. In Florida, in North America, now these creatures had never seen humans, so we know they've never been bitted. They're Pleistocenes before humans were in North America. And we measured the gap there, the bevel measurement, on these wild horses. It went up to about 3 millimeters. We established 3 millimeters as our baseline. Anything over 3 millimeter bevel measurement indicated bitting. These are our modern horses. Up here you can see it goes up to 10 millimeters, and the mean and the median are almost 3 millimeters themselves, and there's Bataille. Statistically, there's another Bataille site, Tersec, which actually the mean and the median are significantly over the wild, and we think there are ridden horses in here, but Bataille is really quite clear. Statistically, the bevel measurements of Bataille indicate that those are not wild horses, unbitted horses. They have been bitted. Another criticism was most of our bevel measurements were taken from horses that had been bitted with metal bits. Modern horses have metal bits. But the Bataille people probably had leather or hemp rope bits, and may cause the same kind of damage. So we got 4 horses that had never been bitted. We didn't care what they looked like or what their personalities were. The only thing was that they had to have virgin premolars. We trained them to be ridden. We rode each horse for 150 hours. That's 600 hours of riding. Each horse had a different organic bit, a hemp rope bit, a horsehair rope bit, a bone bit, and a leather bit. And we anesthetized horses at intervals, as we're doing there, 4 intervals throughout the project, and we made casts of their teeth in order to see what's happening inside their mouths. The veterinarian who worked with us thought this was hilarious. He had never seen anybody do this before. I do think we are the first people to make molds, dental molds, horse teeth in living horses' mouth. We found that throughout the experiment, the bevel measurement increased for all of these materials. And we got to significant bevel measurements for all of these materials, which are pretty soft materials. So the agent of wear is actually dirt. It's not the bit itself. The agent of wear is dirt that's under the bit, and it gets between the bit and the tooth, and that pressing process of holding the bit in the teeth rubs the dirt down into the teeth, and wears the enamel in. And there have been recent publications in tooth microwear research, which is actually a big field trying to establish what the diet of early hominids was, that actually most of the wear on mammal teeth that comes from dirt that they ingest while they're eating. So it turned out to be a good thing that we had these horses, these experimental horses, fed only on pasture and hay, because then they had plenty of dirt in their diet. If we had fed them soft feeds, it would have reduced the amount of dirt in their diet, and we wouldn't have gotten the wear that we did get. So we were trying to recreate prehistoric conditions. We actually rode these horses with bits that were made with flint tools. The cheek pieces were antler cheek pieces that were made with flint tools. We tried to do everything as accurately as we could. So there's been recent publications on this. We are not the only people doing this anymore. We were the only people doing it in the beginning. This is where we see bit wear of the type that I've been describing to you, and at the bottom you can see a photograph of wear that was caused by horsehair bit, quite significant. That's a cast. That's an epoxy resin cast of the horse's tooth. It's not the tooth itself, but it's a very, very accurate cast, up to 2,000 times magnification. There's another kind of wear that's been suggested by Robin Bendry, another researcher in Oxford, on the crow or the front of the tooth, which he did find at the time, made by the bit hitting the front of the tooth and scraping the front of the tooth. And there's a third kind of wear, which other researchers have found on the diastema itself, caused by the bit causing infections on the gums, and an infection goes right through the gum and creates porosity in the bone. That's a relatively rare kind of wear, but we are now restudying our collection to look at these two additional kinds of wear. So the evidence indicates that at Bataille we have domesticated horses and horseback riding by 3500 BC. But in steppes to the west, at places like Siouxsie and Falinsk and Derevka, there's domesticated cattle and sheep 1,000 years earlier. And that's probably where the Bataille people got their horses. Because the Bataille people had no tradition of domesticated animals at all. All of a sudden, domesticated horses show up at Bataille at 3500 BC. But these sites to the west never produce the 300,000 bone accumulations that you have at Bataille. You have maybe, if you're lucky, 1,000 bones. Although they are herders, they had less permanent sites, and so the animal bone collections from the west are much more difficult to study. But if you look at the Falinsk cemetery, you've got 16 horses there. 12% of the animals who were sacrificed in the graves of humans at Bataille are horses, and that by itself is suggestive. The horses are being grouped at Bataille with sheep and cattle. And I lost another image. Okay. Well, there is a symbolic, I lost two images from this. There's a symbolic elevation of the horse indicated by horse head maces and by head and hoof sacrifices of horses at other sites, which you don't see there. Already by 3500 BC, probably I would say by 4500 BC, horses are domesticated and are probably being used for herding, which would greatly increase the efficiency of steppe herding. Were they being used for warfare? This is a bigger debate. I think they probably were used for warfare. This is the Sumerovo migration I was talking about yesterday into the lower Danube Valley, about 4200 BC. Right after this happened, 500 tells are abandoned. There's completely a change of culture. Horsehead maces are brought into the Danube Valley by these steppe people, and actual horses are sacrificed in their graves in the Danube Valley. They're bringing horses with them. Probably they're using horses to raid, but it's not Attila the Hun. When you look at American Indians and the way that they used horses in warfare, often they used horses principally to get to the attack site. If you're going to raid somebody and you know what you're doing, you ought to be able to surprise them pretty easily. The big danger in pedestrian tribal raiding, and that's what we're talking about tribal people here. The big danger in pedestrian tribal raiding was getting away afterwards. Because after you hit them, If you're hitting a village and say you're stealing their cattle, and you might kill a person or two, and then you're trying to get away, you hit them with surprise, but after they've been hit, they're not surprised anymore, and they want to get their cattle back. If you're on horseback, and they're not, you've got them. And that's how American Indians often used horses in their own raids when horses were first introduced to the North American plains. It made the getaway the most dangerous part of pedestrian tribal raiding into a breeze, particularly if the people in the village that you were raiding didn't have horses, perhaps because you had just stolen them. And if that's the case, then horseback riding makes tribal raiding much, much more predictable and efficient. You have fewer casualties. You'll hit them over and over again. You don't have to line up huge armies in order to knock off an agricultural population in a Tell settlement. All you have to do is destabilize their agriculture. And if you can raid them while they're harvesting their crops, then pretty soon they're not going to be able to harvest their crops anymore, and their agricultural system is going to fall apart. Okay, so finally we put it together, riding and driving. We have horse domestication across this area certainly by 3500 BC, and then wagons come. Once wagons are introduced with horses, it absolutely revolutionized steppe economies because horses represented light, rapid transport, scouting, long-distance raiding, herding, and wagons were heavy bulk transport. Prior to 3300 BC, during the Neolithic, all of the archaeological sites that you can find, including the cemeteries, are in this environment, river valleys. There's no sites out in the majority of the steppe environment which constitutes inter-river valley steppe uplands. No human sites out there at all. And then after 3300 BC, when Yamnaya begins, when you introduce wagons and they join horses, people move cultural sites from the river valleys out into the middle of the steppes. And at this point, the Eurasian steppes are domesticated for the first time. Kurgan cemeteries begin to be built out in these high steppe regions where there had been no human occupation before. And the settlements in the river valleys are abandoned. And they are replaced by Kurgan cemeteries. And in fact, over much of the Eurasian steppes and the western steppes at this time, 3300 BC, the Yamnaya culture, it's like the single grave culture in Jutland. You cannot find any settlements at all. We don't know where they were living, and probably they're living in their wagons. And Dory and I conducted systematic survey looking for Yamnaya sites in the Samara River Valley in an area that's studded with Yamnaya cemeteries, Kurgans, including some of the richest Kurgan graves in all of the Yamnaya culture, and no settlement evidence whatsoever. We did close interval shovel testing in areas where you could see nothing on the surface, and we found very low density sites from later periods, but nothing from this period. They're very, very mobile, probably living in wagon camps and spreading out over all of the steppes. And that cannot have happened without social effects. It cannot have happened without social effects. And the social effects is what I was talking about yesterday. Social relations at a distance, guest-host relations, patron-client relations, ritual gatherings, ways of maintaining social relationships at a distance between people who are not seeing each other every day, through reputation, through hierarchical patron-client relationships, and we have evidence for that in Proto-Indo-European. Oh, boy. Anyway, we'll go on to the next one. During the Yamnaya period, there's a shift in diet from the fish diet of the Neolithic to a pastoral diet based entirely on sheep, mainly sheep, milk and cattle milk and meat products. And you can see this in these stable isotope results that we have recently finished in the Samara Valley and the Middle Volga region generally on a large sample of Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals. By the Amnaya period, we have horseback riding wagons and a diet of sheep and cattle milk and meat well established in the steppes. And it's at that point that these migrations begin that probably carried the origins of the Western European, Indo-European languages from the Amnaya culture into the Carpathian Basin and north of the Carpathian Basin into the North European plain. And now finally I'll get to the birth of the chariot. Now we can see that the people from the steppes, far from being primitive barbarians, actually their entire life depended on wheeled vehicles. And they had been dealing with wheeled vehicles for a long time before the chariot was invented. It's often been thought that they were too primitive to invent something as complicated as a chariot with all of these very highly engineered wooden parts that all have to work together and spin for a vehicle that is designed entirely for speed and maneuverability. Why would steppe nomads do this? And that's actually an interesting question. Why did they do it? And there's two possible answers, really. Why do you develop a vehicle that specifically takes an awful big investment effort to do this? That's designed specifically for speed and maneuverability. And the answer is either racing, that's one answer, and I would not put that one down. Think of the Iliad and Patroclus, and the death of Patroclus and the funeral games. Funeral games go probably a long way back. Look at the funeral feasts and deposits at Follies, dated 4500 BC. There may have been funeral games with wheeled vehicles where there were prizes. And it's possible that chariots were invented in an effort to win prizes at funeral games way back in the steppes. The other possibility, of course, is warfare. They were used for war pretty soon after they were invented, no matter what the reason was for their invention. The Sintashta culture is the culture in which we can see the earliest evidence for chariots, 2100 to 1800 BC. Now, the earliest evidence in the Near East begins in 1800 BC. These are many radiocarbon dates that establish this chronology. This is earlier than the evidence for the Near East. So these are the earliest chariots in the world. Sintashta culture out there just to the east of the Ural Mountains was actually linked to a series of other cultures. In our research area, it's the Potapovka culture in the Samara River Valley. There's another culture, Filatovsky, which has exactly the same chariot cheek pieces, double horse burials, similar pottery, similar weapons, so that the ritual side and the technological side of this cultural expression was really widely shared from Sintashta over to the Don River. I would suspect that this represents Indo-Iranian, the origins of Indo-Iranian. And that's why Indo-Iranian shares some links with Baltic and Slavic, because at the western end you can see it's very close to where pre-Baltic or pre-Slavic would have been spoken. Also, it shares links with Greek. Those of you who know about the Greco-Aryan hypothesis, Indo-Iranian languages are linked in a variety of ways with Greek. So Greek must have been off here, pre-Greek, before they went to Greece, must have been off here to the west, linked somehow to this red sphere. I don't know how that was, but it has, linguistically, it has to be that they were linked to that sphere. At Sintashta, just on the east side of the southern Ural Mountains, this is a blob of Sintashta sites there with the Urals on the left. There are these fortified sites that appear. Now, this is in an environment where we haven't been able to find any settlement evidence at all. Bingo. A whole series of fortified sites, heavily fortified sites. All of those are house floors, the rectangles there, with a fortification ditch and a wall around them. And inside every house is evidence for metalworking. Every single house. They're working metal on an industrial scale. And outside these sites are cemeteries that we don't get to see there, where there are chariot burials. I hope we're going to see a chariot burial later on. But right here, the chariots were set The chariots were set with their wheels in slots in the grave floor. You can see a spoke right there. You can see a spoke right there. This is the hub of the wheel, leaving stains. As the wheels rotted, they left stains on the floor. If they hadn't done this, we wouldn't have evidence for it archaeologically, but they cut slots in the grave floor and they stuck the wheels of the chariot in those slots in the body of the chariot in the grave floor. As they rotted, they left evidence behind. They also created these cheek pieces with burrs or studs on the inside. That's a very severe form of cheek piece, but you need that in order to guide a horse from a chariot, because you're no longer sitting on the horse's back, guiding it with your body and your knees. You need something, so particularly in warfare, so that when you pull a little tug on the reins, the points bite into the horse's soft cheeks on the other side, and the horse will turn its head immediately. Well, we're not going to see these. Too bad. This is a view from above, excavation photograph of one of these chariots coming up, and you can see the wheels set in slots in the floor. Outside the chariot graves were these ritual deposits. It's clear that the graves were not attended, the funerals were not attended just by the people who were driving the chariot. There's an overturned pot there, and the bones of 6 cattle, 4 horses. I'm getting there.
So I shouldn't try. I mean, should I try to get the pictures out somehow?
I don't know. Am I running out of time?
I don't know. Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah. So I'll just charge ahead. But that's clearly a single deposit. This is for archaeologists. This is a great deposit. It's in a square pit, 50 centimeters deep. There's an overturned pot there at the top, and there are the bones of 6 cattle, 4 horses, and two rams in that deposit. 2,700 kilograms of meat. Estimate. How many guests can you have for a party with 2,700 kilograms of meat? Maybe 3,000. 1,500 anyway. These funerals were attended by large numbers. So we should not just think about the chariot going into the grave. We should think about what was going on outside the grave at the time the chariots were being buried. One of the criticisms of the steppe chariots that has been raised by the Near Eastern patriots, there's quite a few people who want chariots to be invented by high civilizations in the Near East and not by these barbarians out in the steppes. And one of the criticisms they've raised is that the steppe chariots were too narrow to operate in warfare, and if you went around a corner at high speed, they would turn over. And there wasn't enough room in them for more than a single driver. This criticism was based on this grave, Krivoyo Ozero, which I published, and was one of the first chariot graves published, and happens to be a fairly narrow chariot. It's only about 1.20 meters between the wheels. But there are plenty of other chariots. This one is 1.50 meters, 1.60 meters. Once you get to 1.50 meters, 1.60 meters, you're in the range of Egyptian chariots, the width of Egyptian chariots. You cannot deny, if you're a Near Eastern patriot, that Egyptian chariots were chariots. So some of the chariots in the steppes have a range of widths between the wheels. The larger ones are just as big as Egyptian chariots. The smaller ones may actually have been designed for a single driver. And it is possible to fight from a chariot as a single driver, particularly if the weapons you're using were javelins. And when you look at the weapons that are, unfortunately, that's what you lost is the weapons. Too bad. When you look at the weapons that are buried in these chariots, there's large socketed spearheads, and there's very long, narrow, beautifully made flint projectile points that are really too long, 10, 15 centimeters long. They're too long for arrows, too heavy for arrows, but are perfect size for javelins. And I think that probably just looking at the weapons that are deposited with these chariots, that the principal weapon, not the only weapon, but the principal weapon that was used from these chariots was a javelin. And if you throw a javelin from a chariot, you can drive it at the same time that you're throwing. You don't need both hands to shoot an arrow. So some of these chariots may have been designed for a single driver. who was throwing javelins. And then this is just fascinating. This is incredible. There is a Sintashta variant called Petrovka, very, very similar to Sintashta in every way. There are sites that's slightly later than Sintashta. There are sites that have Petrovka on top of Sintashta in settlement deposits and in graves and kurgans. And the Petrovka variant shows up in Central Asia, Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. And right outside of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex sites, which look like,
Oh.
yeah, that's what they look like. This is the PC map problem. I designed this on a PC, and it's being shown on a map. So for all of us here, when people tell you that they're completely interchangeable, the proof has just been given to you that they're not. But Bactria Margiana archaeological sites are semi-urban sites made out of mud brick, great big things with towers on the corners. Many, many streets and buildings on the inside, completely unlike steppe sites. And inside these sites, you find Petrovka pottery, inside the sites. And then outside those sites, at this grave, Zarcha Khalifa, there's a grave that has Sintashta style cheek pieces, bar bits, copper pin with a horse on the end. There's no question that Petrovka style people were in direct contact with Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. This may be why Sintashta has industrial metalwork, is that they were exporting metal to Central Asia. And that may be why they settled down in the first place. There's absolutely no doubt that the two of them were in close contact, and this one's going to show. This is material from Central Asia. Those are pots from Sintashta and Petrovka, and you can see this Central Asian motif, the stepped pyramid, which is the central motif in the Central Asian decoration, shows up in 5% of Sintashta and Petrovka pottery. It had never showed up there before, this motif, and as soon as Sintashta and Petrovka phase is over, it doesn't show up again. It's only during this period. I think they borrowed the motif probably from imported textiles, which have not survived. So not only is there evidence of steppe material in the south, there is evidence of these southern motifs in the steppe sites. And then Malian on the Iranian plateau, south of Central Asia. Dorianite is one of the first teeth we looked at in the Smithsonian. You begin to see horses with, this is a mule, you begin to see equids with bitware for the very first time anywhere in the Near East. And by 1750 BC, you begin to see these bar-shaped bits. In the Near East, they're made out of metal. In the steppes, they were made out of bone, but it's a clear copy of an earlier steppe, a cheek piece type. And then during the Ur III period, which is about 2100 to 1900 BC, is the first time that you see the word for the horse showing up in Mesopotamian writing. It meant ass of the mountains because it was coming from the Iranian plateau down over the mountains. The native equids of the native Near East were asses and onagers, and when horses first started showing up, they showed up with the bitware and with the cheek pieces and with the introduction of the chariot. I'm just getting my last slide. So I think that probably this is Indo-Iranian coming down with Petrovka, introducing chariotry to Mesopotamia right around 1900, 1800 BC, which is when we begin to see it show up in Mesopotamia. There's probably another move, which we don't see archaeologically nearly as clearly, into India. I would guess that Indic evolved on the border of Petrovka and Bimak, right there, as a contact phenomenon between Indo-Iranian languages, which are being spoken in Sintashta, and the native non-Indo-European languages of Central Asia. And then Indic evolves and moves into northern South Asia, and then is ultimately responsible for the appearance of the Mitanni, who were speaking Indic language in the Near East by 1500 BC. And so probably that's the spread of Indo-Iranian, and I'm going to stop right here because I've run over my time. But thank you very much.
Let's have some questions.
You mentioned they speak banquets and funeral feasts and so on, and most likely they would like to drink during these, probably drink alcohol.
Yeah.
You also mentioned horse milking. Please. So, do you think they already fermented horse milk at that time?
Probably, yeah. Because in Indo-European, of course, there's a root for mead as a drink, not just as honey, and probably it's fermented mead, and that goes back to Proto-Indo-European, which is earlier than this. So they have fermented drinks already, presumably, and it's not much of a step to start fermenting horse milk and make it into kumis, the standard fermented alcoholic drink of steppe nomads today.
I can also add, thank you for this tour, of course, really wonderful. I can add that lactose resistance, when you map the DNA for that in northern India, it's the European type.
Yes, so that Petrovka migration probably, I don't know how to turn this off. The Petrovka migration probably introduces lactose tolerance to the North Indian population, and the DNA for that is still there today. And it's a European, in North India, it's a European gene. It's not the Arabian gene.